Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. And if you just watched me a moment ago, then apologies that I had to jump off screen. But this is my first ever real live stream that I'm issuing a video through. So if you managed to catch it whilst it was live, thank you very much. Hopefully it won't go as badly as the last one, which ended up going sideways, literally where my image was at 90 degrees to the screen. So apologies if you tuned into that one. But I took the feedback from the previous one that people really only want to see one topic in a live stream video. So in today's video, I want to talk about the UK-India trade deal that was announced a couple of days before the UK-USA trade deal. And obviously, that one has now overshadowed the India deal. But the Indian deal is really important because India is projected to be the fourth largest economy in the world in 2025. So it's obviously a really big country for the UK to be exporting things to. And obviously, it's also importing a lot of items from India. So we'll go through the details of the trade deal and we'll talk about who I think has benefited the most, whether or not this is an equal deal, whether both India and the UK have come out of it equally successfully, or if one or the other has gained the upper hand. But before we get into the details of the deal itself, let's hear from Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister.
Day for the United Kingdom and for India, because this is the biggest trade deal that we, the UK, have done since we left the EU, and it's the most ambitious trade deal that India has ever done. And this will be measured in billions of pounds into our economy and jobs across the whole of the United Kingdom. So it is a really important, significant day.
Okay, so Keir Starmer is saying that this is a landmark deal. And it's actually the biggest deal that the UK has done since it did Brexit. And Brexit was actually voted for in 2016. We're in 2025 now. So there's a 9-year gap between voting for Brexit and actually getting any of the deals done. It didn't actually happen until 2020. It took 3.5 years for the government to actually get there to sign the deal with the EU. So this was the biggest deal until the US deal was done a couple of days later. And I wanted to go through the details because the UK government has, in its recent announcement, it basically has said that the benefit to the UK, if we just pause this here, you can see it's saying that as a result of this deal, UK GDP is expected to increase by £4.8 billion, which represents 0.1% of GDP. So a pretty small percentage of GDP every year in the long term. Workers will benefit from wages growing by a further estimated £2.2 billion each and every year in the long term. And the benefits will stretch right across the UK and come in both short and long term. As soon as the deal comes into force, UK products will benefit from a saving of up to an estimated £400 million per year from India cutting its tariffs on existing trade alone, which could increase to around £900 million a year after staging over 10 years. And we'll go on to talk about the details of that because the deal that's been agreed with India isn't actually an instant changing of the tariffs. There's a sort of sliding scale from India's perspective. Now, in terms of why India is important to the UK, you can see from this chart that it actually overtook the UK in terms of its global GDP just after 2020. So sometime in 2021, it became larger. And it's now the fifth largest economy. So we have a look. Actually, just before we do that, I don't know whether you can name the top 5 economies in order. Hopefully, if you follow the channel, you can do that by now. I'm hoping that you've learned something, but we'll just have a quick look. If you look at this chart, it shows the top 10 economies in the world as it stands at the moment in 2024. And you can see that the USA is by far the largest economy with GDP of over $29 trillion. And it achieved about 2.8% growth in 24. China is the second largest with $18 trillion. And that grew at 5%. And the Chinese economy is always looking to grow at 5%. You'll know that if you follow the channel. Germany retained its place at number 3 with 4.7 billion, followed by Japan at 4.1. And then India came in at number 5 with just under 3.9 trillion. So it's trillions, not billions here. And you can see that it's now larger than the UK. And if you look at the right-hand side here, we're showing the projected figures from the IMF for 2025. And you can see that India is actually projected to overtake Japan to become the 4th largest economy in the world. They're both showing at 4.19. But when you go into the further decimal points, India is expected to overtake Japan and become the fourth largest economy. So, obviously, from the UK's point of view, doing a deal with the fourth largest economy is really very important. So, obviously, the UK has a strong history with India. It was part of the British Empire for a while, and obviously, there's a long-standing agreement there. So, this was an important deal from both India and the UK's perspective. Now, in terms of which country does the most trade, this chart shows the amount of imports and exports to and from India and the UK dating back to 2015. So the yellow section at the top shows services imports from India. So that's basically the service industry. So lots of call centers and those sort of things where you can outsource all of your telephone call center business to directly to India. And anyone who lives in the UK, I'm sure, has spoken to an Indian operative at some point when they've been phoning through to various companies. So you can see that that yellow section at the top has grown significantly over the last 9 years and is actually the biggest single portion out of all of the trade in 2024. So India is exporting a lot of services to the UK. The blue section below that shows the goods that India is exporting to the UK. So these are imports into the UK from India. You can see that that's been relatively stable over the past 9 years. There's been a slight increase over the past few years, but between them, they are the main exports from India to the UK. The pink section are the service exports from the UK to India. So that's basically financial services businesses and other types of companies based in the UK that are exporting their products or their services directly to India. And then the black section are the goods that are exported to India. So physical product that's being sent to India. And you can see that out of the four sections, that's actually the smallest in 2024. And then the green section at the bottom shows the trade deficit that the UK has been running with India. And you can see that there's been a trade deficit in every single year since 2015. So what that means is that India has been exporting more to the UK than the UK exports to India. And that's in value terms, obviously, because although India is a bigger economy, the average wage in India is significantly lower than it is in the UK. So the purchasing power of consumers is lower. They're going to pay for things, they're going to spend less per average than people in the UK. But obviously, there are 1.4 billion people in India compared to around 68 million in the UK. So it's significantly bigger. But the green section at the bottom, I think, is really important because it tells us that India is benefiting more from the relationship than the UK at the moment. It's selling more products into the UK than the UK is selling into India. Now, in terms of the UK's trading partners, I thought this table would be interesting to share with you. It shows the top 12 export partners in 2024 from the UK's perspective. And you can see that at the top of this list is the United States. And this list actually includes both services and goods. So in a previous video, I was talking about just physical exports because the tariffs that Donald Trump's been applying on UK exports predominantly is focusing on goods such as automobiles and steel and those sorts of things. But obviously, there's a lot of financial services and other items that get exported as well. But you can see the USA is by far the biggest trading partner for the UK, followed by Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, France, China, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and India is the 11th biggest export partner from the UK's perspective. And in 2024, the UK exported just over £17 billion worth of goods and services to India. Now, in terms of the other side of the equation, you can see here that in terms of imports, Germany is actually the UK's biggest import partner. So it's actually importing a lot more from Germany and the European Union, which is not surprising because they're close neighbors. China comes in at number 2, and that's obviously one of the big issues at the moment that Donald Trump has highlighted, that China is the manufacturing base for the world. It produces lots of things very, very low cost and then exports them all around the globe. And so the UK is buying a lot of things directly in from China. It's buying in around $57 billion worth of goods from the USA. The fourth biggest partner is the Netherlands, followed by France, Belgium, Norway, Italy, Spain, Ireland. So we've got a lot of European countries. Obviously, they're all neighbours of the UK. And India comes in at number 11 on this list. And in terms of how much the UK is buying from India in 2024, it was over $25 billion. So you can see that differential between the amount that it's selling and amount it's importing. And this chart shows the trade, total trade. So you can see here that, and again, this is just goods that I put on this chart. So it doesn't include the services, which we did earlier for the United States. So you can see in 2024, the United States, the UK exported 59 billion and imported 57. So it was pretty much flat. There was a small trade surplus on the UK's perspective. In terms of Germany, there was a massive deficit from the UK's point of view. It only exported 38 billion, but bought 72 billion. We then have the Netherlands, which is basically a major hub for oil and gas. So the Netherlands is basically a middleman. It buys lots of things in or processes lots of different oil and then sells it on. So that was the third largest trading partner. And in terms of where India comes in on this chart, you can see that it's down at number 11. So as we've just seen, the UK exported 17 billion, imported 25 billion, and therefore had a trade deficit to India of $8.4 billion. And so it tells us that the relationship is really quite important. And getting the tariffs right from the UK's point of view is going to mean that it needs to make sure that the import tariffs, the amount that the UK is charging on Indian imports, it needs to get those figures right, because that's the biggest part of this equation. The UK is running this deficit because it's buying more from India than it's selling to India. Now, in terms of what sort of things the UK is buying, this is quite an interesting chart because it shows for 2024 the goods exported and imported to and from India. You can see on the left-hand side here that the exports to India, the biggest single category was non-ferrous metals. So the UK is exporting around $2 billion worth of metals, sorry, £2 billion worth of metals. It's also exporting iron ore and scrap. The third biggest category was mechanical power generators, followed by tobacco and beverages, and then general industrial machinery. Now, in terms of what it's importing from India, the biggest single category was refined oil, which was 1.3 billion pounds, which is over $1.5 billion. And that's interesting because India is a net importer of oil. It imports around 88% of all of its oil. So India does have small amounts of oil that it produces itself, but the vast majority of crude oil is coming from other countries. Now, India has a big refinery industry. So it's got lots of large oil refineries that takes the crude oil in, refines it into products like gasoline, diesel, kerosene, those sort of things, and then sells on the surplus to other countries. So it's acting as a bit of a middleman. It's refining some of those products for its own use, so it'll sell some of it into the Indian market, but it's actually refining more than it needs so that it can benefit from the added value of the refinery process to make some profit. Now, we'll go on in a minute to talk about where India is getting the majority of that crude oil from, because no spoiler alerts, but I'm sure you can guess if you follow the channel. The next biggest export item from India to the UK is clothing, followed by telecoms and sound equipment, medicinal and pharmaceutical products, which I recently made a video about, talking about the fact that Donald Trump is not happy that countries like India and China are producing a lot of pharmaceuticals that are then being sold into the US market. So there's probably some tariffs coming on that very soon. And then iron and steel at the bottom. Now, in terms of the services side of things, the biggest service exports to India is travel. So a lot of people want to travel from India to the UK, followed by transportation, which is far smaller, telecoms, intellectual property, and financial. And in terms of the services being imported from India, other business services is a huge chunk. It's the biggest section on this whole table. And that's basically what we talked about before, where businesses are outsourcing things that need people to answer phones or do some work or do things on PC or back office or analysts or whatever it might be. It's much cheaper to get people in India to do that than it is in the UK. So there's been a lot of outsourcing, followed by travel, telecoms, finance, and transportation. Now, in terms of picking up on that issue about where India is buying its crude oil from, this table shows the figures for 2024. And you can see that right at the top, not surprisingly, if you follow the channel, it's Russia. So India in 2024 bought 36% of all of its crude oil purchases from Russia. And that equated to almost 1.8 million barrels per day. So, what we're seeing here is that India is buying in huge quantities of oil from Russia. That crude oil is then going through the Indian refinery process, and some of that oil is then being bought by the United Kingdom. Now, it's very difficult to be able to trace where oil comes from because once it's been through the refinery process, crude oil is pretty much of a muchness. So, there is an extreme likelihood here that the UK, despite the fact that it's applied lots of sanctions directly against Russia and has refused to buy Russian oil directly from Russia, is buying refined Russian oil that's been through the Indian refinery process because it's very difficult to establish where that crude oil came from. So interesting that it's the biggest single category that the UK is buying from from India, and India is buying most of its oil, or a big chunk of it, from Russia. The other countries that it's buying from, Iraq, which also I'm not sure the UK wanted to buy oil directly from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, United States, and then we've got some very small percentages at the bottom here. But I thought it was worth mentioning that because it's one of the biggest exports from India to the UK, and it's highly likely that some of that oil is coming from Russia. Now, in terms of the actual tariffs themselves, what's been agreed, I thought it was worth having a look at the exports from the UK to India first to talk about the categories that were discussed, the ones that have been identified as needing to be reduced and what's been agreed. So you can see that whiskey and gin, or just spirits generally, but whiskey and gin are the two biggest in demand in India. Previously, before this deal was put into place, the tariffs that were being applied against UK exports of whiskey and gin were up to 150%. Now, obviously, that is a huge amount. And that was put in place predominantly to protect the Indian industry. It produces its own whiskies and gins. And so, in order to help the local brands, there was a large markup applied. Now, the deal that's been agreed is that that's going to be cut to 75%. So it's halving it, but 75% is still pretty high. And then over the next 10 years, it will gradually reduce to 40%. So when you take a step back and look at that, that doesn't look like that great a deal because in 10 years' time, we're still going to have a 40% tariff on UK whiskey and gin. So there has been some celebration in the sector, but it still seems extremely high to me. And in terms of the value of those exports to the UK, it was around £250 million in 2024. Now, the second biggest category here in terms of the amount that's been cut is automobiles. So Land Rover, Jaguar, those sorts of businesses are exporting cars over to India. And historically, that they've been hit with a tariff of between 60 and 125%, which again is really incredibly high. And again, that was to protect the Indian industries. It's now been agreed that that will be dropped to 10%, but there will be quotas. So there will be a limit on how many cars can be exported and then applying that 10% limit. And in 2024, those exports are worth £650 million to the UK industry. So this is a big step forward. If you're coming down from 100% tariff to 10%, then obviously that represents a big opening up of the market for UK cars. So I think that's probably the biggest win out of everything on this table. We've then got cosmetics, which historically have had somewhere between 10 and 20% applied to them. That's going to be dropped by 50% to between 5 and 10%. And that equates to about £350 million of value in 2024. Medical devices had between 7.5 and 10%. That's coming down to 2.5 to 5. We don't have the data in terms of what the value of that market is at the moment. Aerospace was being hit with 10 to 25%. That's being dropped to between 5 and 10%. That's about £215 million, that market. Food products, lamb, salmon, chocolate, and then at the bottom, we've got soft drinks and biscuits. They've been hit with somewhere between 20 and 50% historically. That's coming down to somewhere between 10 and 20%. So still fairly high, between 10 and 20%. And in total, that was around £300 million, the value of that market last year. And electrical machinery historically have been hit with between 7.5 and 15% tariffs. That's coming down by half to around 5 to 7.5. And that equated to almost 600 million, that market. So when you take a step back and look at this, there's obviously some benefits here. The tariffs are coming down, but they're not being eradicated. They're not going down to zero. They're basically being halved roughly in most of these situations. The automobiles is probably the best deal that's been struck, but there's still going to be a 10% tariff on UK automobiles being sold into India. So overall, it's better than it was, but there's still reasonable tariffs, somewhere between 5 and 75% on these products. If we have a look now at the Indian deal, so what's happening with regards to Indian exports to the UK, you can see that the biggest part of this market in 2024 was textiles and apparel, so basically clothing, those sort of things. And before this deal was agreed, the UK was applying somewhere between 8 and 12% tariff on those imports. It's now been agreed that that's going to be wiped out to 0% for 99% of the exports. So that's a massive win from India's point of view. They're having all of those tariffs waived. And if you think back to what we just talked about for the UK hasn't achieved that on any of its exports into India. Marine products is next on this list. They were being hit with between 10 and 20%. That's been dropped to zero as well. And that was £300 million, that market in 2024. Leather and footwear was between 8 and 17%. That's been wiped out. And that was 545 million that was projected to grow to 545 million by 2027, but it's over 450 million in 2024. Gems and jewelry is almost £1 billion market. It's certainly more than $1 billion. And historically, they were being hit with between 2.5 and 6% tariffs. They've been wiped out as well, as have auto parts, which previously were between 4 and 10%, toys and sports goods between 4 and 6%, and organic chemicals were between 2 and 6%, 6.5%. So when you take a step back, this table tells you that India has achieved a massive win here because they basically had the tariff eradicated on all of their exports. And that isn't the same as what the UK have agreed for their exports into India. So in terms of who's done better out of this deal, it's clearly evident that India have had a massive win. And of course, as we talked about earlier, they're already exporting more to the UK than the UK is importing into India. Now, so there's a lot of people not very happy with this deal. Keir Starmer, we heard at the beginning, was delighted with it, but there's many commentators and politicians who are very unhappy with it. And one of the other things that's now come to light is that in addition to waiving these tariffs, the UK has also agreed to waive national insurance payments for Indian employees who are working in the UK for an Indian company. So if you work for an Indian business and you're sent to the UK for a year or 2 years or 3 years, historically, you would have had to pay national insurance. And national insurance is basically a form of tax in the UK. It isn't income tax. It's taken directly at source from either employers or employees. And it all goes into the funding for things like the National Health Service. And if we have a look at this table, it shows that the new deal that's been agreed basically says that Indian workers, if they're paying national insurance back in India, they now are exempt from paying national insurance in the UK. And this has caused a lot of upset because in the recent budget, the Labour government increased national insurance from 13.8 to 15%. That's for employers. And that was seen as a stealth tax. So they said they weren't going to increase income tax, but instead of doing that, they increased national insurance. So the bottom line was that people were either going to be paid less or companies were going to have to find more money to pay that national insurance, the increase. So it was an increase in costs for companies. It was seen as being a roundabout way of gaining more money from business rather than just taking it from income tax. And so it's caused a lot of upset. And the fact that Indian businesses and Indian employees are now exempt from it is causing a lot of complaint. And you can see here in terms of, I've put an example together of the average salary in the UK in the last 12 months was around 37,500. So I've just put an example here that a UK-based employee, so somebody who lives in the UK, who's from the UK, if you're earning £37,000, you'll have to pay on that per year just under £2,000 in terms of the national insurance that will be taken out of your end of the payment, so your contribution, and your employer will also have to pay 4,800. So in total, for your £37,000 salary, the government will be taking £6,754. So that's basically what they're taking in addition to any tax that you're paying. The example I put on the other side of this, obviously, is an Indian employee who's working for an Indian business who's paying insurance or national insurance back in India. They now won't have to pay any of that. So the employer doesn't pay it and the employee doesn't pay. So they're basically £6,754 better off than a UK business and UK employee. And that's causing people to get a little bit upset, I think, in terms of whether or not that's equitable, whether that has been a good deal. Now, there is a trade-off in terms of if you're a British employee and you go and work in India, then you don't have to pay Indian national insurance. But we saw earlier in the table that India is providing a lot more services to the UK than the UK is providing to India. So in terms of who's benefiting the most, it is definitely India from that perspective. Back on the screen. Sorry about that. So in terms of the summary and conclusion today, I think what I wanted to share with you was basically the terms of the deal to look at what's going on and why this is important. And as we saw, India is now the fifth largest economy in the world. It's going to be the fourth largest very soon during 2025. So it's a big player. It's a really important deal from the UK's point of view. And as we saw, they do a lot of trade together. It's the 11th biggest trade agreement from the UK's point of view. But as it stands at the moment, India is benefiting more from this trade agreement than the UK. It's selling more products and services to the UK than the UK is selling into India. And the trade deal that has now been agreed looks to be really beneficial from India's point of view. They've seen the tariffs that were being applied against Indian goods and services basically being wiped out. They're not having to pay virtually any tariffs at all on all of their exports to the UK. However, the UK hasn't been given the same deal. It's seen its tariffs halved, and in some situations, they're still sitting at 75% for whiskey and gin, so still incredibly high. So we haven't seen a like-for-like trade-off in terms of the deal that's been agreed. India looks to have benefited the most out of this arrangement, even though Keir Starmer said he was delighted with it. And the UK government have said that the UK will benefit by around £5 billion per year. But I think India is likely to see a much greater benefit than that in terms of the increase in its exports into the UK. And it will be interesting to see whether the UK continues to buy refined oil products, because as we discussed, India is sourcing almost 40% of all of its crude oil from Russia. So it's virtually guaranteed that some of those refined oil products will be made using Russian oil. So effectively, the UK is buying Russian refined products via India, even though it's got heavy sanctions in place against India. So thank you for watching this live stream video all the way through to the end. Hopefully it was okay. I'm slightly new to this technology, so apologies if it was a bit messy in a few places. Hopefully it was fairly smooth. I'm trying to do my best. I'm getting up to speed with all of this. But thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. I didn't manage to have the comments on today. So if you have come onto the live stream and sent me a comment, apologies that I didn't respond to it, but I can't see it at the moment. I'll have a look at the software and make sure that it's working okay for the next one. But thank you so much for your support, for watching today. Thank you to everybody that's bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently. Really appreciate that. Thanks to everyone who's a Patreon or a YouTube member or Buy Me a Coffee member. That really helps to keep me going. And here is something to put a smile on your face. I've actually got something to finish off with.